Okay, so we're on a UK field trip. Now, this was actually last year, but like you say, we do lots of field trips, so do come along to one if you can. It's well worth coming and seeing. This was one of our field trips last year, and we are at a place called Derbyshire, which is in pretty much the centre of the UK. It's in the Peak District. We've got some great geology, some great things we were digging through, and there in the background is Mam Tor, which is quite a famous mountain or a hill here in the UK. Very mountainous looking, and you can see all the layers, and these layers are what are known as Carboniferous. Now, we've dealt a lot with layers. Diane talked about Devonian, we've spoken about Jurassic. Carboniferous, full of carbon. It's where the coal is. In fact, if you look on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see that black rock. It's a shale. Shale is layers and layers of thin mudstone, and if you pick up this shale and break it open, it stinks like a diesel engine because it's got lots and lots of carbon in it. It's got oil in it. Lots of coal from this area as well. We're right next to the famous Blue John mine, where the famous sort of semi-precious stone comes out of the beautiful blue crystals. Okay, what are we doing here? Well, we're looking for fossils. Of course we are. And do we find fossils? Yes, we do. We're here in the Carboniferous. If you're over in the States, by the way, you don't call it the Carboniferous because you couldn't possibly go with the English names. So you call it Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. No guesses as to what they're named after. But have a look at what we're starting to pull out. Can you see the plant, the fossil plant? Now, when you first pull these out, because they're carbon rich, they begin to oxidize when they reach the air. And you can begin to see a bit clearer what we're actually looking at. You see where I'm pointing out the arrows? Oh, we've shared this on here before. I'm sure we have. This was actually just the first ever, I was just there showing people, oh, look, this is what you do in order to find fossils. You split rocks open like this and, oh, look what we've found. It was pretty spectacular. Get up nice and close, put it under a special filter. Can you see the fossil thorns? There's no doubt about it. These are thorns for sure. And we've spoken about thorns before. That's not the focus of our topic tonight, but it's an important one because we're asking the question, how old are these polystrate fossils, these fossils that go through many layers of strata, and how long could they take to actually form? And it's a good place to start with a biblical perspective. So the Carboniferous is supposed to be around 304 million years old. That's the age of these supposed rocks. Now let's go to Northumberland and hey, now we're getting into the real polystrate fossils. Can you see the rather fantastic lycopod tree right next to me there? This is also Carboniferous rocks. And you've got this spectacular lycopod tree with the bark still on it and a bit of a root system, bit of a bulb, and it's protruding up through multiple layers of rock. Interesting. We're looking at these rock layers here, and these rock layers are supposed to be about 318 million years old, about the same kind of age. These are also Carboniferous, full of coal. You can see all the coal seams all the way along. And yes, also out of here, we dig out fossil thorns. Nice, beautiful fossil thorns. Take them home, dry them out, clean them up a bit. Really beautiful fossils. Okay, question. Northumberland, UK, polystrate trees, fossil thorns. How long have you got to bury them? Because the fact that we find thorns here adds an extra dimension to the age, because these are supposed to be 318 million years old, but according to scripture, they're not. What am I talking about? There it is there. Then God said to Adam, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I have commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, the ground is cursed for your sake, in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life, both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. You do realize that scripture is not just history of the world, it's not just history of the universe, it's not just history of our salvation or God's salvation plan, it's also history of thorns and of thistles. Now, scripture is abundantly clear. Thorns and thistles are the result of the curse. Thorns and thistles are the result of man's sin. Therefore, thorns and thistles were not on this planet until after Adam sinned, until after man was on the planet. Therefore, these are less than 10,000 years old at the most. Oh yes, I say at the most because if you count up the genealogies, you get to an age of the Earth of somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 years. If you want to argue that there are gaps in the genealogies and you want to stretch the genealogies as long as you possibly can, the oldest you can possibly make the Earth is about 10,000 years. Beyond that, you're simply not taking Scripture at its word. Now, I don't believe there are gaps in the genealogies. I believe the Earth to be about 6,000 to 7,000 years old. However, despite this, even the oldest age biblically that you can get is still less than 10,000 years. Now, that puts the 318 million years into jeopardy according to Scripture. Interesting point. But let's get back to this Polystrate tree here. Now, I saw this on a geology group and I said, I have to go see it. I asked very nicely, could you tell me where you found this? Oh yes, here it is. Off we popped to go and have a look at it. And we got some pretty spectacular results from it. It was well worth the journey up. Beautiful fossils and a beautiful Polystrate tree. Now, this was the best preserved one, but there are actually multiple others. And what was interesting is we also found roots. But the roots weren't joined to the bulb of the tree. The roots were actually above the tree. Interesting little thought. How did they get up there? And the roots that we found weren't even connected to any tree at all. They'd been ripped off for sure. Interesting. Well, let's have a look at a little video now of our discoveries when we actually went to see this. We put it out on our Facebook, I believe, when we first went to go and see this over a year ago now, but it's well worth the watch.
Hello and welcome back to Creation Research Live. I'm Indiana Joe, and yes, we're back on the beach in Northumberland. This is our last day here. We've been filming for the upcoming series of Creation Research Unplugged. That's our second series, so do make sure you tune into that on creationresearchlive.com. But if you remember yesterday from our broadcast, we were having a look at this tree here. Oh, it's a fossil tree. It's a polystrate tree. Poly means many, straight refers to strata or layers. This is a tree which is protruding through many different layers. And we were talking to you about the bark and how brilliantly preserved it is. It's a lycopod tree. We were talking to you about, you can see how it's got this base that comes out. No apparent roots. It's definitely got a big bulb on it though. It should have plenty of soil if it was living here, growing here and dying here, but there's no soil at all. All of the sediment is squashed up around it. This tree has been transported here. A huge flooding event that has washed it into place. Now, since coming here, and we've been doing lots of filming, we've been doing lots of finding fossils, so we want to show you some of the fossils, as well as some of the other trees that we've found, because this is by far the best preserved one, but we've actually found 6 other trees along here. So come along with me, and let's see if we can spot any more of them. Now, there are 2 just quite close together up here, and you can see the same thing in every single one of them. So here's one here. Again, it's not as well preserved, or it's become a lot more eroded, but you can see the edge of it, the coal which is just running down there. You can kind of see the general structure. There's another one just behind me here that you can see as well. So there's 2. There's another one over here, and there's actually one that is quite a bit higher up. So I've been excavating this one. We only saw just the tip of it, but it does certainly seem that the top has been ripped in half. You can actually see where the coal actually finishes around there. So this is a tree which has had its top completely ripped off and just its stump fossilized here. There's no evidence whatsoever that it was ever growing further up. It's literally been ripped in half. Again, it didn't live here, it didn't die here, it didn't get buried here, it's been ripped up and it's been swept along. Come back along with me, and you can see another one here. And this is one which we've also excavated and uncovered. Look at this, you can see the details of the bark and all the ridges. You can see the coal still in there. It goes up into the cliff, but we're not wanting to destroy all of this cliff to expose some more. But you can see the coal down the bottom here. This is actually a really, really big tree. So there's another one. And then finally, we're not going to be able to show you all the rest of them, they're too far to go. But I do want to show you this fossil up here. You stay down there, Sarah Ann. I'll climb up here. can you see up on here, we've got another, this is a horsetail fern, which is cutting up through the rocks. Again, polystrate, it's protruding its way up through many different layers. And all of this evidence goes to show that it did not live here, it did not die here, it did not get buried here. These have been washed into position. And the fact that they're cutting up through many layers, well, there's some pretty big cliffs here. This is a pretty big deposit. And it was Professor Derek Ager who first admitted the problem. He was by no means a friend of the Bible, but even he admitted it is ludicrous to assume that if these dates are correct, then it would have taken over 100,000 years just to bury one of these trees. Ridiculous statistics, there's no way they'd have survived. I'll tell you something else that wouldn't have survived, fossils. And we've been finding plenty of them, so follow me back over here to our base camp. We've got some fabulous fossils that we've been digging up over the past 2 days. Fossils which are, well, they're living fossils. Living fossils was a term coined by Charles Darwin. They were supposed to be anomalies, but they're really very common. They're creatures which haven't changed in the slightest. We've also found some fossils which you can find all across the world in these Carboniferous deposits. Carboniferous? Oh, just refers to the coal. Have a look up there. Can you see the coal seam running along the top there? Carboniferous refers to coal. In the USA, they're known as Pennsylvanian or Mississippian. But come and have a look at some of these fabulous fossils that we found. This is one of my favourite. There's so much going on here. Get it nice and in focus there. Can you see all the mash of fossils? I mean, we've got horsetails, we've got little tiny ferns, we've got these little seed cones here as well, like from the lepidodendron stuff. It's absolutely fantastic. Huge, great big fossils as well. This is a wonderful, beautiful little fossil there, can you see? Absolutely stunning. All the leaves intact of the stem as well. Wonderful fossils. Fossil thorns as well, which we've been finding there back at home. More of these great big horsetail rushes as well. Wonderful fossils. Now all of these fossils go forward to show one very important point, and it ties in quite nicely with the fossil tree. If you want to get a fossil, you need to bury it quickly, you need to bury it deeply, and you need to bury it without the presence of oxygen. Now this is supposed to be a swamp-like environment which slowly accumulates over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Now you've got 2 problems with that. First of all, you'd never actually get a fossil. In the slightest. They would just become destroyed. If you want to get beautifully preserved fossils like this, you need to bury it very quickly indeed. Also, your biggest problem are these trees. The fact that they protrude up through many layers shows that they had to have been buried very quickly indeed. They wouldn't sit around for 100,000 years waiting to slowly be fossilized. All of the evidence from there being no roots, from the sediment pushed up around them, from them being transported into place, goes to show that they were buried very, very quickly. Oh, and one final point, we've found these trees all around the world. I personally have seen them in Tennessee. If it wasn't for the fact that we were right next to a beach, you wouldn't know that these weren't in Tennessee, just looking at the trees themselves. We've also found them down in Newcastle in Australia. We've found them in Nova Scotia. We've found them in Canada and Alaska. They're all over the world. Wonderful evidence of a massive major catastrophe which washed over the land, sweeping these all into position. Evidence of Noah's flood.
So here's Australia. You can see Brisbane. I live just outside of Brisbane, and you can see Sydney, and you can even see Tasmania down the bottom. Now, it's roughly 600 miles for those of you in America, or 1,000 kilometres for those of you on metric, between Brisbane and Sydney. Now, there's the state of Queensland. Jurassic Arc is in Queensland. And I'm showing you this so you can actually get an idea of some of the scale of these things. Gympie to Brisbane, I travelled it twice yesterday to retrieve our credit card machines for ministry this weekend. It's 120 miles, 190, roughly 200 kilometres to Jurassic Arc. In the early days, we're doing exploration. There's our geologist, Liam. He's using a water excavator. Great to be able to do this. Liam's a gold geologist, but been a great help out at Jurassic Arc. You can see the big dam behind, which gave rise to finding some of these things. And we had some reporters from one of the newspapers turn up, big Australian newspaper, and we were showing them some of the things we'd found. You can see Liam pointing to some orange and white layers. You can see a pine log labelled at the back. The orange and white layers show the direction of the strata. There's the strata direction, and you can see a polystrate tree at Jurassic Arc. It's at right angles almost to the direction of the strata. And you're looking at the bottom end, it has no roots. To date, we've found no branches on it. There's a big broken log to the right-hand side, but no branches or roots on it as well. Definitely polystrate or many layers. All right, so there's the newspaper man taking some pictures, and this is going to turn into a full-page article in the Australian biggest daily newspaper. Okay, strata and tree, and it was very evident that the layers of rock were deposited in less time than the pine tree, which is what we're looking at, the polystrate pine tree, actually took to rot. Why do I mention that? Pine trees are softwood. Whether they're Araucaria in Australia or Araucaria in England, they're softwood. You don't use them for building the outsides of building. Keep them inside, keep them out of the weather. They rot really quickly. Now, the newspaper man's comment, we are impressed. And yeah, they didn't like the implications of what we were doing, but they were impressed with the findings. Polystrate trees at Jurassic Arc, they cross many layers. Now, if we move now from Gympie via Caloundra out to a town of Gatton, a big farming community, there's one of the road cuts. Now, fantastic layers, black, white, black, white. But the black in this case is caused by trees, pine trees that have been squashed and carbonized in where you find them. Squashed because they were soft, buried, and full of water when they were squashed. The tree is preserved, some of it's carbonized. Oh, while we're doing this polystrate program, George Bond asked us a question about polystrates. Now, this is an introduction to that question, and George, don't worry if we don't answer it today. We'll get all the pictures ready and show you the evidence of what's actually inside these polystrate trees in many locations around the planet. Now, this is a horizontal tree, but you'll notice one thing, it's half the thickness of my hammer handle. So therefore it crosses many layers, even laying down horizontally. At one end, there's a log jam, and the rocks here, well, you can see half squashing of the trees. At the other end, yes, you can see many rocks, many fossils, and they're going in all directions. It's definitely logs that are jammed up, and it's in Jurassic rock, same as Jurassic Arc is in. But here's the giveaway. There's two semi-horizontal logs. You can see the bottom one. You can see the base of the tree. You can see the roots have been ripped off. On the top one, you can see part of the trunk. You can't see the base. But in the middle, can you see the one that's crossing many layers? That's polystrate. It's at 45 degrees to the main angle of the bedding. Polystrate crosses many layers. Sometimes they just go across two. Sometimes they're just thicker than several grains of sand. And as Derek Age and others have pointed out, every fossil is in essence polystrate. So how do you bury it before it disintegrates? How do you bury it in the case of, well, the biggest polystrate tree I've seen is 100 feet tall, 30 meters. which meant it was buried from one end to the other before it fell over. Smashed polystrate log. The one thing you can be dogmatic about this site, it never was a fossil forest. And we've gone on to investigate all the Jurassic rocks in Australia, and they're full of smashed logs, full of horizontal logs, and full of very obvious polystrate logs. In fact, at Jurassic Arc, we have a big poster painting of the various polystrate logs that we've actually been to as proof of Noah's flood. Hence Jurassic Arc, not Jurassic Park. They're the ones that I've seen and found around the planet. We won't go into all of them today. Keep watching for the Polystrate program on Search for Science, whatever it is, Standing for Truth, towards the end of October. So go to their website and find out exactly when it is, and you hear a lot more about these. First of all, the famous one on the top left-hand corner. Original etching. Where was that tree found? Not far from where my dad grew up, in Leith in Scotland, the old Leith quarry. Closed now, but you can see this one's at 45 degrees. Now, it may be easy to explain a tree that's vertical because it grew there, it was held up by the roots. It's easy to explain one that's horizontal because it had fallen over and washed into place. How do you deal with trees that are at 45 degrees? And what's inside them? Is it petrified? Is it just permineralized? That's the question that somebody asked Standing for Truth. Well, I can tell you where it is today. Yes, I traveled to go and see my dad's old family house and all of that, visit the nearby, and you'll find there's the tree. There's the original one, right? It's now lying horizontal because some workmen took it and laid it in the Botanic Gardens. So you can see it's a fair-sized tree. But see at the other end, no roots came with it. No branches appear on it. And it's pretty solid. Is it petrified? Or is it just a cast that was filled in with minerals later on? Either way, you have a tree that you have to explain. Now, here's our rather renowned Polystrate tree tank. Oh, yes, it's just a big aquarium. And we sink rocks into that. I'll show you more, sink trees rather, a little later. I'll show you more of those experiments. But look, when you actually get, there's how many of the trees end up. Some of them are leaning against the glass, and they're obviously at an angle. But see the one on the right? It's not leaning against the walls. It's just standing up at 45 degrees. And because we progressively filled this, can you see the one in the direct front? No, it's not leaning on the glass. It's actually in the tank. And you can see the layers of sandy material that are burying it. You can make copies of these polystrate trees just simply by getting a pile of sticks. I will keep watching and I'll show you the rest of the technique. But can I encourage you, whether it's Joe in England or Diane and I and Craig in Australia, all this sort of research costs and it does need your support. So we'd encourage you to give and give generously towards it. Even the cost of making up logos. Yep, small I know, but it is significant. Now, this is the main portion of this next section because it deals with the history of the trees that we found, because God has blessed us with finding many trees in the rocks. Oh, I've quoted from King James here, you will go out with joy. I'll be honest, I love going on field trips. You'll be led forth with peace. Yes, beating the rocks is a good way to relieve your frustration, but this is the peace of the Lord. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you, and the trees of the field shall clap their hands. You know, you'll find the trees are trees that in history, these are the trees that their branches are waving. But it's also true of the trees that are dead and buried, and some of them are beautifully preserved, and all of them are a reminder of rapid processes. Let's have a look. Here's some of the first ones I came across. Yes, other people found that, not me, but I went to check it out. Can you see the two trees from the bottom coal layer? Now, when these were first found, the geologist who found them said they went from one coal seam to the next. Now, these are pine trees. Pine trees don't like coal swamps. They don't like swamps at all, not Australian pine trees. And they would rot and disintegrate. But of course, by the time I came across this site, there were people poo-pooing it. You can't show the trees went from one coal seam up through the next coal seam. In fact, there's the diagram I presented to the Sydney Basin Coal Conference, and later we produced in one of the creation articles. Coal at the bottom, coal at the top, no roots known, and the pine trees going up right through it. There's the technical diagram. Some of you who subscribed to the Technical Journal years ago may remember that. That's my first diagram there, showing the various beds of muddied, stratified tuff of volcanic eruption material. But was this the tree just buried in volcanic ash? Well, let's go back and do some excavating. For those people who think you can't have trees going through coal seams, can you see the horizontal black lines? We've excavated those to show that this pine tree, even at the bottom, goes up through many coal seam layers. That's my friend Jeff Smith, who died a couple of years ago. He's a Christian guy, so I know exactly where he is. He's better off than down here with Putin and the Ukraine and all sorts of politicians wanting the taxes to go up. There's the excavation. Now, we spent many hours excavating that tree. Can you see the black layers? It goes through multiple coal seams. So you've got ash, mud, then a coal seam. Ash, mud, then a coal seam. Oh, and by the way, this is a pine tree, but at the bottom, there are no pine leaves. So even as the first professor who excavated here, the trees that he found out, he said they didn't grow here because there's no pine tree mulch at the bottom. Look, there you are close up. A pine tree standing upright going through multiple coal seams. Now, that's not the ones referred to in the original report. You see, by the time we actually excavated from top to bottom, yes, where did it go? Well, not just through the multiple coal seams, but can you see the black layers? Well, the black layers aren't coal that grew in a swamp, because look at the angles of the black layers. These have been washed in or blown in. Debris washed in, blown in, and a tree going up right through them. Well, let's go up to the top. There's Jeff and me sitting above the top pilot coal seam. What are we doing? We're finding the fact that the tree actually goes up through the top coal seam and further up. Now, just to prove my copyright on this, I took some lovely plastic bags, put a note inside it and said, found and excavated by John Mackay and Jeff Smith on the date. I did that because no one else could then claim we didn't actually find this tree. No one had gone to the trouble of digging up this pine tree. We know it's a pine tree. It's got the actual full identification of the pine tree in the rings that sort of go radially and the rings that go around and round. Yep, there's me. I need these proof shots. And between the top pilot seam and the lower pilot seam, there's all those mini coal seams. In fact, there's another one we spotted. It's a pine tree going up into the top pilot coal seam and coming from the bottom. Wow. Now, did you hear about these sort of things in your coal seam geology? No, and you didn't hear about these either. Yes, I know there's not many geologists that travel with brooms, but if you want to clean the cliff off from its ashy mud and show up the trees, you actually have to carry the equipment with you. And look, there's one of my famous ones. It's a pine tree that's dumped and snapped in two. Even the snap, the break, is still preserved, and the tree is replaced totally by an iron compound. But notice it's black on the outside, coal on the outside, minerals in the middle, and the snap still preserved. Snap, sudden, snap, lots of pressure. Oh, and here's an interesting one. There's two trees, one balancing on top of the other. You see the tree to the top right? You see the tree down the bottom? You see the top right one doesn't have any roots either? Now, when you want to know how this could happen, think carefully. All of this is ash mud. All of this is trees that didn't grow there. Therefore, how did they get there? They must have been knocked down somewhere else, lifted up, carried, buried in water, and carried by water and wind to the point where one is sitting directly on the other with the roots broken off. In fact, all up and down the coast at Newcastle, where I took young Joe, there are polystrate trees everywhere. And he's the first finder of thorns amongst these trees. I was so jealous. There's one there. You see there's trees in multiple layers, trees that are turned to iron. Here's a famous one. Not me, the tree, right? Because not only did I go and we filmed that, it's actually in Darwin on the Rocks. If you want to stream that video, you'll actually see this evidence for yourself. It's pretty tough to get down there, by the way. It's right down a cliff, a fabulous bit of exercise walking down, even more walking up. And this tree, yes, we've excavated down to where the roots are or where the roots should be, and anything that's left is broken and snapped. And the tree is iron on the inside and coal on the outside. But here's a older, more famous tree. Not older in terms of geologic terms. There's me actually going on a research trip in the UK, because on the cover of the old Geology of Manchester area by Eager and Broadhurst is that tree. Now, many people have tried to find this since, and it just seemed to have disappeared. So we went and we found out why. Well, you can see it's sort of covered with moss. Or you can see a bit of the left-hand side of the tree because yours truly excavated it. The rocks have fallen down, covered it over. It's no longer attractive. So we cleaned it up a bit. There's me for scale. Now, this is a tree that's famous. It went way up high and a little bit further down. And there's what the Geology of Manchester area official publication says. This tree was apparently overwhelmed by flooding. Now, this wasn't a popular report because it gave rise to the concept of flood geology in a modern context. This is a flood deposit. Even if you thought the tree grew there and then it was rapidly buried from bottom to top. This is the one that even Ager and the others are saying, you know, if you're going to bury this by slow deposits, then you've got plant layers, you've got shell layers. This would take hundreds of thousands of years and the tree would simply rot. Showing you how well preserved it is. A couple of fingers from my compatriot that day, showing you the strata goes right up alongside of the tree. And the bark is still there, but the bark is turned to coal, and the middle, what's in it? Well, you'll have to watch the program with Standing for Truth, because we're going to go into depth into what's inside these. But cleaning it up, yep, we needed to clean it up, but then we discovered something interesting. Inside the base of it is yet another tree, just like we had in Australia. And alongside the edge of these trees, you still see, even inside, the bark has turned to coal. In fact, there's a general rule that the fossil trees that you find, even the upright ones, it's only ever the outside that turns to coal. Coal seams are not made of multiple trees that are coalified. It's only the outside of the tree or the bits of bark and leaves that turn to coal. Well, we've gone down, 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 and you can see the base of the tree, and you can see the other one inside. One tree, another, etc. Definitely flood buried. This whole lot, whether you're Ager or Eager, this is a flood deposit, even if you just took the immediate 20 or 30 or 40 feet of the trees in this area that have been rapidly buried. But what it does give you a clue, Joseph mentioned that he's been in Tennessee and seen some of these. I've traveled all over the planet, so let's help you. So Derek Ager. The one thing I like this guy for is he just didn't sit in his ivory tower office or laboratory and speak. He traveled. And that's the big advantage that Joe and I have got. We've been there, done that. Here's a piece. Now, why don't you give up debating us? The Carboniferous extends essentially the same form from Texas to the Donetsk coal basin north of the Caspian Sea in the old USSR. This amounts to some 170 degrees of latitude, and closing up the Atlantic by a mere 40 degrees does not really help at all in explaining the remarkable phenomenon. In other words, throw in continental drift and it still doesn't help you explain deposits of trees that are 130 degrees at least when you're cheating. Doesn't help you explain that deposit at all. But get ready, the flood deposits not only go from Tennessee, actually they go all the way from Mississippi and down into the Gulf of Mexico, because I've been down there to check. And I've followed them all the way across through Europe and into Asia. And look, I've been to the ones in Australia. That's where I saw some of my initial polystrate trees in this Carboniferous area. That's where we have our sort of edge of the Carboniferous in Australia. Flood deposits are worldwide. And the significance of this, whether you're George wanting to know what's inside them, whether you're just interested in fossil collecting and going to find thorns with Joe in the UK, these deposits, flood deposits, on this scale are huge. Can I encourage you again? This research needs your support. Now, because I messed up the program a fair bit with my time loss, and I'll get it right sooner or later, I've just discovered one of the programs. I'll share it with you guys that helps us here a bit. Let me do the last little bit here. How does this actually happen? There's one dam drying out. I'm in Kentucky. Look what I noticed. The trees, the branches, the stems are floating upright. Can you see that there? Some of them are horizontal. Some of them are vertical. Some of them are at 45 degrees. In fact, it seems they start out floating horizontally, then they begin to sink. One end sinks first, till finally they end up vertically, and then they sink to the bottom. The most famous example of this, Mount St. Helens blowing up, blew hundreds of trees, thousands, millions of trees into the nearby lakes, took them off the sides of the volcanic areas. One of our guys took these pictures. He was a student at ICR in those days. Bob Powell, still a member of our team, even though he's retired from geology. Okay, there you go. Notice how many of the trees have been floating now for a couple of years. They've lost their bark, but they're still floating. And some of them are floating vertically. Clue. Let's take an experiment. A Jurassic Arc Polystrate test tank. We put the branches in. We put them in, well, they float horizontally anyway, no matter which way you want to put them in. They don't all sit above the water. They're sitting in the water, and like a living plant, whether you know it or not, but you all know it because you've cut a rose and put it in water, or a flower, the plant stays apparently alive because the water still goes up the stem even after the plant has been decapitated. There's what you end up with. Yes, my picture as a reflection. Do you see the Scottish trees at 45 degrees? You see the other ones at vertical? Look at that. You can imitate exactly what you see in the rocks. Now start burying those trees, those branches with sand, and you'll end up mimicking. And that's what we do at Jurassic Arc. Can we make these deposits quickly and with minimal trouble that duplicate what's out there in the real world? You see, again, the point is simple. We can do this because it's not time, not millions of years that is involved in making polystrates. It's a process. The process that trees get waterlogged at one end well before the other, so they will start sinking. Then they'll sink at that end faster, they'll end up inclined. Then they'll stand on the bottom because one end is deep and one end is heavier than the other. Then they'll fall over like the ones you can see because the whole tree gets waterlogged. Okay, one last important point. This issue is important. We spend money and time. We encourage you to spend your time praying for us and your money supporting us because there's real conflict here with Christianity. There's two teachers I took down to see this tree. One of them used to be an unbeliever on the right-hand side. The other guy I've known for years and years and years and worked for his dad who's a pastor. All right? This guy's really enjoying his day, noticing the layers of muddy volcanic ash that go up against this tree, checking the bottom to see there's no pine tree debris there. So this pine tree, which is totally replaced basically with iron, with coal on the outside, didn't grow there. If it did, there should be pine tree preserved everywhere, but there isn't. Pine leaves, that is. Okay, Mark became a Christian. Mark is involved in education. Mark now knows that he's been lied to. When you look, we have not been told the truth about fossil trees. We've not been told the truth about fossilization. We've not been told that it's not time but process. We have been lied to. There's no other way you can say it. Somebody set out to lie to us because they knew the truth of this. Remember we've dealt with Charles Lyell? Well, Charles Lyell as a lawyer and Charles Darwin as a graduate theologian knew very well what your New Testament said. Jesus said, if people do not hear Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even through a tiddling little resurrection. Now, I'm sure you'd be persuaded by seeing somebody raised from the dead, but persuaded of what? You'd seen something spectacular? Or perhaps you'd explain it away by saying they weren't dead in the first place. You see, the opposite of that, the reverse of that, is if people do hear, listen, accept, believe Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, creation, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel, the law, they can be persuaded through one rising from the dead. That's what happened to Mark. Can I encourage you? That's why we encourage you to support what we do, support Joe, support Vance in England, support Craig in Tasmania. We look forward to hearing from you on our website, creationresearch.net.